Good evening. Global pop superstar Katy Perry is tonight at the centre of a police investigation over bombshell claims of sexual abuse inside a Melbourne nightclub.
For decades, Florida has been losing a war it didn't start. Somewhere in the swamps south of Naples, in the tangled sawgrass of the Everglades, an invader from the other side of the world has been quietly eating its way through an entire ecosystem. And for a long time, nobody had a real answer for it. Then a handful of biologists tried something so strange, so counterintuitive, that when they first floated the idea out loud, colleagues thought they were joking. Their plan was simple to say and almost impossible to believe. To beat the snakes, they would use the snakes. Today, that strategy has turned into one of the most effective invasive species removal programs on the planet, and the story of how it got there is stranger, funnier, and more remarkable than most people realize. Before going any further, it's worth clearing something up. You may have seen versions of this story online claiming Florida deliberately released thousands of snake-hunting creatures into the wild, as if the state flooded the Everglades with an army of trained predators overnight. That is not what happened, and the real version is more interesting anyway. The actual number of tag scout snakes working the swamp at any given time is around 40. With roughly 110 used in total across more than a decade of research. The reason this story spread the way it did is not because the numbers were staggering. It is because the idea itself, using an invasive predator's own instincts to hunt down more of its own kind, was strange enough to go viral on its own merits. And somewhere along the way, the retelling inflated the scale to make the headline hit harder. The truth needed no exaggeration. It just needed someone to explain it properly. The Burmese python is not supposed to be in Florida. Its home range stretches across Southeast Asia, through the humid river basins of Myanmar, Thailand, and southern China, where it fills a normal ecological role as a large, patient ambush predator. Nothing about it is unusual there. It has predators, competitors, and a food web that has adjusted to its presence over thousands of years. South Florida is a different story. Investigators believe the snakes arrived through the exotic pet trade sometime around the 1970s, brought in by breeders and collectors drawn to the python's size and striking pattern. Some almost certainly escaped. Others were very likely released deliberately by owners who underestimated how large a cute hatchling could eventually become. A python that fits in a showbox as a juvenile can stretch past 16 feet and weigh well over 100 pounds within a few years, and not everyone who buys one is prepared for that. One incident that has been repeated often enough to become part of the local mythology of this crisis involved a python breeding warehouse that was destroyed by a hurricane, scattering hundreds of young snakes into the surrounding wetlands. Whether any single storm event was solely responsible for the population start is debated among researchers, but stories like it capture something true about how invasive species so often take root, not through one dramatic event, but through the accumulation of small, careless decisions made by an exotic pet industry that was, for a long time, barely regulated at all. Florida did not pass meaningful restrictions on owning and breeding large constrictor snakes until years after the population was already established in the wild, which meant the state spent decades effectively subsidizing its own future problem before it moved to correct costs. Whatever the exact mix of accidental and deliberate releases, the outcome was the same. The Everglades gave the pythons almost everything they needed: warm, wet, prey-rich terrain with a climate close enough to home, and critically, no natural predator built to hunt something that size. Alligators occasionally tangle with pythons, and there are documented cases of both species killing the other, but there is no consistent predatory pressure keeping python numbers in check the way they would be in their native range. Left alone, the population did what invasive predators do in a landscape with no checks on them. It grew. Wildlife agencies now estimate that somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Burmese pythons may be living across South Florida, a range so wide it says as much about how hard these animals are to count as it does about how many there actually are. Pythons are extraordinary at not being seen. Their coloring blends into leaf litter and shadow. They can go months between meals, and they spend much of their time coiled motionless in dense brush, which is part of why the true population number remains a moving target even for the scientists who study them full-time. The damage this has done to native wildlife is not subtle once you look at the research. Long-term surveys conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey and partner universities documented severe declines in mid-sized mammals across areas where pythons became established, including sharp drops in marsh rabbits, raccoons, opossums, and bobcats. In some of the hardest-hit survey zones, sightings of these animals collapsed by more than 90% compared to areas outside the python's range. White-tailed deer, once common throughout the Everglades, have also been found repeatedly in python stomach contents, and biologists estimate that around 1 in 4 adult female pythons removed from the landscape in recent seasons had a deer in their digestive tract. That matters beyond the individual animals lost. Marsh rabbits, rodents, and small mammals form the base of the food chain that native predators depend on. When pythons strip that layer out, they are not just killing prey animals, they are starving out the bobcats, birds of prey, and other native hunters that rely on the same food source. Researchers studying diet contents across hundreds of captured pythons have documented more than 70 different native species being consumed, from wading birds to full-grown alligators in extreme cases. This is not a predator quietly taking its share. It is a predator restructuring an entire ecosystem from the middle out. The scale of individual pythons recovered in Florida also helps explain why the threat is taken so seriously. Researchers with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida have documented the largest female python ever recorded in the state, measuring 18 feet long and weighing 215 pounds, along with the largest male on record at 16 feet and 140 pounds. An animal that size has no trouble taking down full-grown deer. And necropsies performed on captured females have occasionally turned up the remains of white-tailed deer still largely intact inside the snake's digestive tract. These are not small, opportunistic feeders picking off the weakest members of a population. They are apex-level predators capable of consuming prey that, in almost any other North American ecosystem, would have no reason to fear a snake at all. On top of the direct predation, pythons brought something else with them that most people never hear about: a parasite. Burmese pythons in Florida carry a lung-dwelling organism called Raeliatella orientalis, sometimes referred to as snake lungworm. It causes little trouble for the pythons themselves, since the two species evolved together back in Southeast Asia. But Florida's native snakes never developed any resistance to it. Researchers first identified the parasite in a native snake in 2012, and studies since then have tracked it spreading well beyond South Florida into the central and northern parts of the state, infecting nearly a fifth of Florida's native snake species and, in some cases, killing them. It is a quiet second front in the same invasion, and it illustrates something important about ecological damage of this kind. It rarely stays contained to a single, visible problem. Florida's first response to all of this was straightforward and very human: send people out to find and remove the snakes. The state built a formal python elimination program through the South Florida Water Management District, hiring contracted removal agents to patrol public lands across Miami-Dade, Broward, Collier, and several other counties. Every year, the state also runs the Florida Python Challenge, a public hunting competition that draws hundreds of participants, some professional wildlife handlers and some total amateurs, all competing for cash prizes tied to how many pythons they can capture within a set window. In one recent year, more than 800 participants combined to remove nearly 200 snakes, with the top individual hunter alone accounting for 20. These programs work, and they matter. Over more than a decade of combined removal efforts, government and non-profit teams have pulled tens of thousands of pounds of python out of the Everglades. But there's a hard limit built into the method itself. Pythons are ambush predators built around staying hidden. A human walking a trail, no matter how experienced, is working against an animal that has spent millions of years of evolution getting better at not being seen. For every snake a hunter finds, an unknown number sit coiled in the brush a few feet away, completely undetected. Traditional ground searchers were removing snakes, but they were nowhere close to catching up with how fast the population could reproduce. Florida needed a way to find the pythons that didn't rely on human eyesight beating python camouflage, because that was a fight humans were always going to lose. The breakthrough came out of the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, a non-profit research group that had been running a python tracking project outside Naples since 2013. The project started as pure research. Biologists, led by wildlife scientist Ian Bartasek, wanted to understand basic things about python behavior in Florida, how far they traveled, when they bred, what habitat they preferred. To do that, they surgically implanted radio transmitters into a small number of captured male pythons and released them back into the wild, then tracked their movements over time using old-fashioned radio telemetry, the same general technology that has been used to track wildlife since the years around the Second World War. What the team noticed changed everything. Male Burmese pythons are relentless when it comes to finding mates. During breeding season, which runs roughly from November through April, a tag male will travel remarkable distances specifically to locate a reproductive female. The research team realized they were sitting on a built-in detection system. As Bartasek later put it, describing the moment the strategist shifted, they were watching their tracked males consistently lead them straight to large breeding females, and eventually, they simply decided to weaponize the snakes. The mechanics behind this are worth walking through in more detail, because the process is more careful and more scientific than the phrase weaponized snakes might suggest. When a male python is captured for the program, veterinarians perform a minor surgical procedure to implant a small radio transmitter into its body cavity, a routine technique borrowed from decades of wildlife telemetry work on everything from birds to large mammals. The snake is given time to recover before being released back into the same general area where it was found, since researchers want the animal continuing its natural behavior, not adjusting to unfamiliar territory. From that point on, the python is simply allowed to be a python. It forages, it moves through its home range, and when breeding season arrives, it does exactly what its biology compels it to do: search relentlessly for a receptive female, sometimes traveling for miles across dense, near-impossible terrain to find one. Field teams check in on each tagged male on a rotating basis using handheld antenna receivers, walking toward the strongest signal until they physically locate the snake. Most of the year, this simply confirms the scout is alive and roughly where expected. But during peak breeding season, which researchers say tends to cluster suspiciously close to Valentine's Day, a scout snake's movement pattern changes in a way trained biologists can recognize immediately. A male that suddenly breaks from its normal range and beelines toward a specific location is very likely closing in on a female, and the team follows. What they often find at the end of that trail is not a single snake, but what researchers call a breeding ball, a tangled mass of multiple competing males coiled around one large reproductive female. In one especially productive single day recorded by the team, 2 separate breeding balls were broken up within a 24-hour window, yielding 11 snakes and roughly 500 pounds of python removed from the landscape in one sitting, an outcome that field biologists still describe as one of their best days on record. That is the origin of what the program now calls scout snakes. These are male pythons, surgically fitted with a radio transmitter, released back into the landscape, and then tracked on a regular basis by field biologists carrying antenna equipment. Instead of searching randomly through hundreds of square miles of dense wetland, the team follows a tagged male directly to wherever python breeding activity is happening. When a scout snake leads researchers to a mating aggregation, sometimes called a breeding bull, the team can remove not just the male doing the leading but the reproductive female and any other males competing for her at the same time. Removing one pregnant female during breeding season prevents an entire clutch of eggs, sometimes 70 or more, from ever hatching. When this idea was first pitched more broadly, it drew exactly the kind of skepticism you'd expect. Using an invasive predator as a tool to hunt more of itself sounds, on paper, like a plan a cartoon villain would come up with. Critics wondered whether releasing more pythons into the wild, even tagged ones working for the research team, was responsible at all. It is easy to see why the concept produced a few raised eyebrows before anyone had seen results. Then the numbers started coming in, and they were hard to argue with. The Conservancy currently maintains a working network of around 40 active scout snakes at any given time, monitored across a roughly 200 square mile stretch of public and private land running from Naples through the Western Everglades. Since the radio telemetry program began in 2013, the team has used a total of about 110 different scout snakes over the life of the project, cycling individuals in as others are lost, retired, or occasionally killed by native predators. One tracked male, nicknamed Loki, was reportedly taken down by a bobcat, a small but telling reminder that the ecosystem still fights back in both directions. The cumulative totals are what really tell the story. Across the life of the Conservancy's program, the team has removed roughly 1,750 pythons, totaling more than 53,000 pounds of invasive snake, and stopped more than 20,000 python eggs from ever hatching. The most recent breeding season, running from November 2025 through April 2026, was the organization's best yet. 177 pythons removed, weighing a combined 8,080 pounds, more than 4 tons in a single season, along with roughly 4,100 eggs taken out of circulation before they could hatch. The season's largest capture was a 17-foot female weighing over 150 pounds, discovered by a scout snake named Snarkwin during the very first outing of the season back in November. There is a detail buried in that success that matters even more than the raw totals. Long-term monitoring has started to show the scout snakes struggling to find mates as easily as they once did, or locating females that are noticeably smaller than in earlier years. To a biologist, that is not a disappointing result. It is a sign the underlying population is genuinely shrinking in the areas under sustained pressure because there are fewer large breeding females left for the scouts to find. Bartasek and his team have been careful and consistent in saying they are not winning the broader war against pythons across all of South Florida. Radio telemetry, for all its success, is still labor-intensive, decades-old technology being applied by a relatively small team across an enormous landscape. But within the 200-square-mile zone where the program operates most intensively, the trend lines are moving in the right direction for the first time since the crisis began. Part of why this story took so long to get attention is that it does not look dramatic from the outside. There is no single moment of triumph, no dramatic capture of some record-breaking, mythical snake that ends the invasion. It is field technicians walking through wet sawgrass with an antenna, checking a signal, walking further, checking again, sometimes for hours before finding anything at all.